Imagine standing on a hill at sunset, watching armies stretched to the horizon. Not hundreds. Not thousands. But hundreds of thousands. Flags ripple in the wind. Horses thunder across plains. Messengers race across continents carrying commands from a single ruler. For a brief moment in human history, entire hemispheres moved according to the will of one empire. Today we divide the world into nearly 200 nations. But there was a time when just a handful of empires controlled almost everything. The idea seems impossible now. Borders shift. Nations rise and fall. Yet history hides moments when political power expanded to such enormous scales that it reshaped entire civilizations. These were not merely large countries. They were planetary forces. Systems so vast they controlled the movement of trade, the spread of languages, the rise of religions, and even the fate of entire populations across continents. Among thousands of kingdoms that have existed over the past 5,000 years, only a few achieved something truly extraordinary. They became the largest empires humanity has ever known. But here is where the story becomes strange. When we hear the word empire, we often imagine Rome. Legions marching across Europe. Marble cities. Gladiators. Yet Rome, one of the most famous empires in history, does not even rank among the top 3 largest. In fact, the empires that ultimately dwarfed it expanded to scales ancient rulers could barely imagine. Some controlled nearly a quarter of Earth's land. Others ruled territories so vast that messages from one side of the empire to the other could take months to arrive. Historians studying these enormous empires have discovered something fascinating. Their rise was rarely slow and predictable. Instead, many exploded across the world with astonishing speed. In some cases, within just a few decades, a single leader transformed scattered tribes or distant colonies into world-spanning powers. Entire continents suddenly found themselves connected under a single system of laws, roads, taxation, and military command. Trade routes stretched across deserts, steppes, and oceans. Cultures collided. Technologies spread. And millions of lives changed forever. But power at this scale creates a dangerous paradox. The larger an empire becomes, the harder it is to control. Communication slows. Local rebellions ignite. Rival powers gather strength at the edges. The very size that makes an empire powerful also makes it fragile. Like a massive star growing too large to sustain itself, these colossal systems often collapse under their own weight. So which empires reached the greatest scale in all of human history? 3 stand above all others. The British Empire, which once ruled over a quarter of the world's population. The Mongol Empire, forged by lightning-fast conquests across Asia and Europe. And the Russian Empire, stretching across an entire continent in an endless expansion of land and power. Each of these empires changed the course of history forever. Each reshaped the map of the world in ways we still live with today. But their rise also reveals something deeper about human ambition, power, and the fragile nature of civilization itself. Because the true mystery is not simply how these empires grew so large. The real question is, how long can power on this scale ever truly last? To understand how the largest empires in human history emerged, we have to imagine the world not as we see it today, but as it once was. A fragmented landscape of tribes, kingdoms, and scattered civilizations separated by mountains, deserts, and oceans. In this world, power rarely traveled far. Most rulers controlled only a few hundred miles. Communication was slow. Armies moved on foot. Geography itself acted as a natural barrier against domination. And yet, somehow, 3 empires shattered these limits. The first was born from one of the most unlikely places on Earth, the windswept grasslands of Central Asia. In the early 13th century, a leader named Genghis Khan united scattered nomadic tribes into a single war machine. What followed was one of the most explosive expansions in human history. Within just a few decades, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe. At its peak, it covered around 24 million square kilometers. The secret was not just brutal conquest, but speed. Mongol riders could travel nearly 100 miles in a single day. Communication networks called yam stations allowed messages to cross continents faster than anything the medieval world had ever seen. For the first time in history, the vast trade routes of Eurasia, from China to the Mediterranean, fell under one political system. But centuries later, another empire would eclipse even this scale, without conquering most of its territory through massive land invasions. Instead, its power arrived by sea. Beginning in the 16th century, a small island kingdom slowly built a global network of colonies that eventually became the British Empire. Through naval supremacy, trade companies, and strategic colonization, Britain established control across North America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and Australia. By the early 20th century, the empire governed roughly 35 million square kilometers, almost a quarter of Earth's land surface. At its height, nearly 1 in 4 humans lived under the British Crown. The empire's mechanism was not just military force, but infrastructure, global shipping lanes, telegraph cables spanning oceans, and financial systems centered in London. Yet the largest continuous land empire in modern history followed a completely different path. Across centuries, rulers in Moscow pushed outward across forests, tundra, and steppe, slowly absorbing enormous territories. This relentless expansion created the Russian Empire, which eventually stretched across 22 million square kilometers, from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Unlike maritime empires, its growth was gradual and territorial, driven by frontier settlements, military outposts, and the desire to secure vast natural resources. The result was a continental empire spanning 11 time zones. At first glance, these three empires appear completely different. One was forged by nomadic horsemen, one by naval power and global trade, one by steady territorial expansion. But historians have uncovered a deeper pattern behind all of them. Each empire mastered something that earlier civilizations could not. They solved the ancient problem of distance. Through horse relay systems, oceanic shipping routes, or continental infrastructure, they turned enormous spaces into connected systems of power. And once distance could be controlled, empires could grow to unimaginable scale. But there was one thing even these colossal systems could never fully control. For a moment in history, these empires looked unstoppable. Borders stretched across continents. Armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Trade flowed through roads and sea routes that connected half the planet. From London to Delhi, from the Mongolian steppe to Eastern Europe, from Moscow to the Pacific Ocean, power seemed limitless. But history carries a quiet warning: the larger the empire, the louder the illusion of permanence. The Mongol Empire once ruled more territory than any land empire before it. Yet within little more than a century after the death of Genghis Khan, its vast domain fractured into rival khanates. Distance that once enabled conquest became a barrier to unity. Communication slowed. Local leaders sought independence. The same mobility that allowed the Mongols to conquer continents could not hold those continents together forever. Centuries later, the British Empire appeared even more permanent. Its navy dominated the oceans. Its trade networks controlled global markets. Maps colored in imperial red suggested something astonishing: a world system centered on a single island nation. Yet within just a few decades of the 20th century, that immense structure began to dissolve. 2 world wars drained its strength. Colonies demanded independence. By the late 1900s, most of the territories that once formed the largest empire in human history had become independent nations. The Russian Empire faced a different kind of collapse. It expanded for centuries, slowly building one of the largest continuous land territories ever ruled by a single government. But enormous geography created enormous pressure. Diverse cultures, political tensions, and economic struggles built quietly beneath the surface. In 1917, revolution shattered the empire almost overnight. A system that had taken centuries to build collapsed within months. This is the paradox historians continue to study. Empires grow through power, military strength, economic influence, technological advantage. But the larger they become, the more fragile their foundations grow. Administration becomes harder. Local identities resist central control. Supply lines stretch thin. And the very scale that once created dominance begins to generate instability. In other words, empires do not simply fall because of enemies. They fall because complexity eventually overwhelms control. The story of humanity's largest empires reveals something unsettling about our species. Again and again, civilizations attempt to build systems larger than anything that came before them. Larger armies. Larger economies. Larger global influence. Each generation believes it has solved the problem of scale, that this time the system will endure. But history whispers a different truth. The Mongols conquered continents faster than any empire before them, and vanished. The British ruled over a quarter of the world, and faded within a century. The Russian Empire stretched across an entire continent, and collapsed in a single revolution. Civilizations measure their power in land, wealth, and time. But history measures something else. Every empire, no matter how vast, is only a temporary moment in the long story of humanity. And the forces that shape our world today may one day become just another chapter in the rise and fall of empires.